16th century England was a time of great turmoil and upheaval. And it was a very complicated time to be a Christian. You had Henry VIII, and then you had a series of different monarchs, some who chose to be Catholic, some who chose to become quite enthusiastic Protestants, and others decided to go down the path of what then became known as the Church of England. There was a piece of poetry that developed at this period of time called The Vicar of Bray. Some of you might have heard of it, about a priest who was the parish priest in Bray who changed whatever his opinions were based upon whoever the monarch was at that particular time. And in one sense, he did whatever it took so he could continue to have sort of a comfortable life. And St. Paul talks in the first reading today that we're called to be all things to all people. But I don't think what Paul is saying is that we should say one thing to one person and say the completely opposite to somebody else. What he's reminding us in this first reading, writing to the Corinthians today, is that the emphasis of what we do should be to be able to communicate the gospel to people of all sorts of different backgrounds. It doesn't mean that we sort of say, well, this person likes this thing, so we'll say this, and then we'll go and say the complete opposite to somebody else. That's not being authentic to the gospel. In the 16th century, it was a complicated time, and some people, unfortunately, didn't have the courage to preach the gospel consistently, and they would just respond or say whatever the king or the queen at that particular day wanted. But as Christians, we're called to preach confidently every day, to speak of the good news of Jesus Christ in all sorts of different contexts. But we shouldn't compromise the gospel. That's not what Paul's wanting us to do. He wants us to be all-rounders, though, especially for priests and for those in leadership within the church. We should be able to communicate the gospel to people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And sometimes that's a challenge. It's a challenge for me. I'm probably sure it's a challenge for Deacon Jonathan as well, to try to work out how do we communicate the gospel to people of all sorts of different backgrounds that I've not been exposed to at different times. And so Paul gives some of that sense today. How can we be all things to all people? I think that's reflected within our own lives as well. How can we communicate the gospel, be faithful to Jesus Christ, but to be able to connect with people of different backgrounds? Whether it's someone who might have a great interest in sport, well, we might start a conversation about sport. Or someone who's got great interest in literature, well, we might start a conversation about literature and bring them to understand that the scriptures are a great piece of literary work as well. And then from there, introduce them to Jesus Christ. Or someone who might be interested in building. Well, Jesus has all sorts of parables about building. And you see this in the life of Jesus. He takes lots of different directions, but he's still consistent with the same message. So let's not be like those in the 16th century who decided to change their spots all the time depending on whichever king or queen was in authority. But let us be faithful to speaking Jesus Christ, but be creative in the way that we do it. When you speak to a little child, you use the language of a little child. We don't reject the gospel or dumb down the gospel, but we still speak it at a level that a little child can understand. Or someone who might be an academic, well, we might use some of those language. Or someone who's really interested in sport or science or all sorts of things, we use those languages as well. How can we be all things to all people? Let's not do that by compromising the gospel or compromising the truth. Let's be faithful to Jesus Christ in all things, but use the language of people of all sorts of different times and backgrounds to communicate effectively the message of Jesus Christ.